scripture reading is from the 25th chapter of Proverbs, beginning with the 6th verse, found on page 595 in your pew Bibles. Do not put yourself forward in the king's presence, or stand in the place of the great, for it is better to be told, "Come up here," than to be put lower in the presence of a noble. Word of God, word of life.
Thanks be to God.
Please stand as you are able for the reading of the gospel.
Well, that may be the new secret for shorter worship service. Now before us the Holy Gospel according to St. Luke, the 14th chapter. We begin. On one occasion, when Jesus was going into the house of the leader of the Pharisees to eat a meal on the Sabbath, they were all watching him closely. When Jesus noticed how the guest chose the place of honor, he told them a parable. When you are invited by someone to a wedding banquet, do not sit down in the place of honor, in case someone more distinguished than you has been invited by your host. And the host who invited both of you may come and say to you, "Give this person your place." And then, in disgrace, you would start to take the lowest place. But when you are invited, go and sit down in the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he may say to you, "Friend, move up higher. Then you will be honored in the presence of all who sit at the table with you. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted." Jesus also said to the one who had invited him, "When you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or your rich neighbors, in case they may invite you in return, and then you would be repaid. When you give a banquet, invite the poor, the cripple, the lame, and the blind, and you will be blessed. You will be blessed because they cannot repay you. For you will be repaid in the resurrection of the righteous. The gospel of our Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
The congregation may be seated. So first comes a story that I usually save, not today, for more jocular company. So be light and easy right now. You're aware that I have 2 daughters, right? That means that I have a little experience with sisters. Though myself, I only have a brother. But as daughters, I have sisters. Now, they spent a good number of years growing up trying to stake out their own turf. And because they lived at Dad's house sometimes and Mom's house sometimes, there was always a little bit of competition to see who could get Dad's attention. One of my favorites was they would intentionally sit when Dad would take them to the restaurant to have daddy-daughter time. When Dad would take them to the restaurant, they would intentionally sit and face each other, so that Dad would have to choose who to sit by. Dad noticed this pretty early, and so I went into the rotation plan, you know, sometimes here, sometimes there. They, of course, kept track of how many and who and which and the like that I would sit next to. And after a few years, maybe it wasn't a few years, but after a little bit of time went by, they said, well, Dad, we've decided that you like me better because you sit next to me more often than you sit next to, and then the other sister was named. They're both present for this. To which my response was, well, maybe I sit next to one because I like looking at the other better. Oh my goodness! They used to argue who would get to sit in the front with Dad in the car. And they would argue about it. And whenever the argument lasted longer than it took for me to get in the car, I would move them both to the back seat. Which I understand in some cultures is really the place of privilege. I mean, after all, you're being chauffeured by the help. If you ride in the back. Not in our culture, though. I mean, people, young people especially, literally compete for the shotgun position. You've heard that called, haven't you? Have you ever called shotgun in a car? I mean, you have to think all the way back to your youth, don't you? You know, or maybe you just need the extra leg room, or maybe it's just a little easier than climbing over that folded seat. My goodness, why don't you just get a four-door car? My daughters would argue over whose turn it was. And I told them, you're both going to ride in the back until you can settle that without it being an argument. And they came up with a rationing program, you know, every other time. But then they found out that, you know, the other time was always the long trip when the other one was in the front seat. And so that wasn't fair. So they went for one whole week, one in one way, and a whole another week in the other. And, you know, that didn't, well, they found another way that didn't work out. And the fairness just wasn't there, and just, rah. Well, fortunately, they grew up. And Margaret was visiting, and Janice was finished graduating from college. It was one of those great weeks when the whole family was in close proximity, so I drove to see them. And we gathered in the car and we went over to a park where the three of us took a long, beautiful walk. Walked down to the riverbank, and we found stones, and we walked further, and we walked and walked and walked. And when we realized that we had, it was one of those places where they had the solar system laid out on the ground so that you could see relative distance from one place to the other. We started at Pluto and got all the way to the sun. And then we walked across the street because over here was a trail that led all the way back to the parking lot. And we walked across there, and we walked on that trail, and now it was unfamiliar and not marked, and all sense of distance was disappearing, and the woods was getting thicker, and so were the mosquitoes. And as we got near the parking lot, just barely, is that the right parking lot is kind of the question in our mind. We're tired. And it's been a long walk and the destination isn't, but then all of a sudden you can see my car. And one daughter yells, "Shotgun!" And the other daughter goes into a rant. I don't know where she gets that from, but goes into a rant that we're grown-ups now. You don't go calling shotgun, and that isn't fair, and it's not right, and da-da-da-da-da, and just really. And I got to see sisters again. And I was just quiet all the way to the car, and they had embarrassed themselves in this process, and the one who had called shotgun was trying to back out of it, but the other one said, "No, you called it, go ahead." And when we got to the car, I simply gave the keys to the one who lost shotgun and made her the driver. And I climbed in the back seat. Tip of the day. Don't even bother to get in the way of who's more important than who. It's a genuine waste of time. It genuinely is. I hope Margaret and Janice aren't watching today. But maybe one of their Facebook friends will send them a link. They've heard me tell the story many times. They sort of enjoy telling it themselves as well. It is a good tip of the day, as it would come out of Proverbs, that you not just move forward as if you know that you're the most important person at the banquet and that your place of honor is waiting for you. It would be recognized as a little unseemly if you chose a rank that wasn't entirely appropriate, especially in the mind's eye of your host. Not the right spot for you. And so it sounds like a reasonably good piece of behavior, but, well, you heard Kim read it to us, and like a good proverb, it just ought to stick in there for just a moment or two. And we're pretty sure that Jesus sort of had this one in mind already, aren't we? This is a banquet put on by the head of the Pharisees. Quite frankly, this is the hoi polloi. And people do know their pecking order. Aren't you glad that we don't, in our culture and society, don't worry about class and who's more important than whom and who has first rank? And I mean, after all the rank that it's not born into us, we earn it. We earn the right to go first. It used to be Johnny Carson's great gripe that he had to go wait in line at the DMV. He had to literally show up himself instead of sending an assistant. And he had to wait amongst all the people who he was more than happy to entertain and receive this great wealth. But oh my goodness, and God forbid that you work at the DMV, because you're the ones causing this terrible problem. Never mind, it's the taxpayers who refuse to pay the higher taxes to have plenty of facility available. But nonetheless, aren't we fortunate people to not think and worry about class and distinction in such a fashion? Or does this tip of the day seem to ring true? That we not think too much of ourselves. It wouldn't be a bad tip of the day if we picked up on that idea and not just in simply executing that strategy of, when we're invited to a banquet, not just assuming that we have the most important place. Even small children know where the most important place is. I hauled in a kids' table from the Sunday school classroom many years ago. It was long and it had 8 places and 2 more at the head and the foot. And I set it up right in front and put the chairs all around, and I said, now, at your home, where does your mother sit? Where does your father sit? Where do you sit? Where does your younger? Where does your older? And they all knew exactly where to sit, where to be. Might be a little more difficult these days because when families these days get together for a meal, it's usually in a car. And so then it's shotgun and backseat and the 3rd row of the van. But they all knew. And I said, well, what would happen if, let's say, what would happen if your school teacher came over on that particular evening? Where would she sit? Or he sit? Oh, they all knew. Oh, it would be at this spot. And they had no problem with that. And I said, and what would happen if the principal of the school came? Oh, well, then it would be, they would sit here and here. And they had no problem understanding that. They got the pecking order pretty clearly. That young, really. I mean, you would think it would all be blended in because we assemble the children based on their ages into individual classrooms. I was really tempted to ask them where the pastor would sit. The pastor was invited over, but I was a little afraid that it might be heard as solicitation of dinner invitations. So I just kind of let that one go. It's very clearly laid out in our minds early and often. And it takes all of these special forms. So, yes, it's a good tip of the day, but like a good piece of wisdom, there's a solid idea underneath it. Not to think more of ourselves. Jesus adds, it says, all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and all who humble themselves will be exalted. And we kind of check off that list, because we are really quite proud of our own humility. Remember the days when we would kneel at the communion rail? Remember when we were young and we would come and if we were especially virile, wouldn't even put a finger on the rail as we put our knees down on that pad. Didn't really care whether it was cushioned or not. As we grew a little older, we thought, well, there should be some cushions. Then the cushions got fancier with embroidery on them, and we knelt. We knelt because it's a humble posture. With our whole bodies, we assume this posture of humility for what God does for us at that place. Spot on. And then our bodies wear out. Our backs cry out to us. And our knees. And still we would come to that rail and we're going to kneel. If it's the last thing we do, if the pain takes us out right now, we're going to kneel. And pride takes over for humility. We're going to make it happen. We're going to show God that we can still do this, and certainly the people around us, that we can still do this. Even if the doctor has said, don't kneel on these new knees, you'll ruin them. And then it's gone. In a flash, without even knowing it. Jesus isn't anywhere near done reshaping us. We need not just this tip each day, but so many others. He gives one to the very person throwing the banquet. Jesus knows his Bible. There's a passage in Deuteronomy. It would have made the first lesson a longer lesson. But it's all about tithing and giving and how you do it and when you do it and where it's from and all of those kind of things. And then it finishes with every third year you shall bring out the full tithe of your produce for that year and store it within your towns. Obviously, these are some instructions that we do not follow to the letter. Careful as you pick the passage that really works in your favor, because there are others in there that do not. The Levites, because they have no allocation or inheritance with you, will share in this. Also, the resident aliens, you know, the ones who have no citizenship in the country that God has given to you. The resident aliens, the orphans, the ones who have no family connection. And the widows in your town, the genuinely impoverished, who can own nothing because they are women and not men. So why would they be allowed to own things? This is who we are to. They may come and eat their fill. It's the gift that we gave to God, that tithe, that does the feeding. They may eat their fill so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work that you have undertaken. Out of gratitude, we make this gift to God for the glory of God, and they may eat their fill. All those who we have stepped in front of in the way that we have gone. If the blessings of our prosperity, if the gift of our prosperity is not for generosity, of what use is it? To hoard for our own selves? To take a bigger and a better place? Ridiculous. These tips of the day have everything to do with transforming our hearts and our minds into the kinds of disciples that Jesus is, well, calling forward. The kinds of discipleship that he is literally teaching, the ones he's called out of the boat and out of the tax booth and off of the street and into the witnessing of what God is doing in the world. What God is still doing in the world. Amen. Let us stand and sing our hymn of the day, For the Fruit of All Creation.